You want to go to college? Fine, figure it out, my mother said, signing my brother's tuition check right in front of me. 7 years later, they invited me to their charity gala to witness their success. They have no idea the woman at the back table is the forensic auditor tracking their dirty money. When I stand, they will think I came to apologize. I am standing to read the audit. The final twist is in the ledger. My name is Lucy Johnson, and tonight I am sitting in the darkest corner of the Grand Mercer Ballroom. Around me, 300 guests clink crystal champagne flutes beneath towering chandeliers that drip with golden light. The air is thick with the smell of roasted filet mignon and the heavy, expensive perfumes of local politicians and wealthy socialites. Local media cameras flash continuously near the main stage, capturing the opulent, almost suffocating luxury of the BrightPath Future Fund annual gala. It is a spectacular show of wealth and charity. It is also a spectacular lie. On the brightly lit stage stand my parents, Richard and Elaine Johnson. They are the evening's guests of honor, the founders of the fund, the ultimate model philanthropists. My mother approaches the microphone, delicately adjusting her designer silk wrap. She pauses, letting a perfectly timed tear slip down her cheek. She wipes her eyes with a lace tissue and leans into the microphone. She begins speaking in a trembling voice about the profound, agonizing sacrifices parents must make for their children's education. She talks about the sleepless nights, the empty savings accounts, and the selfless devotion required to build a brighter future for the next generation. The audience, dripping in diamonds and bespoke tuxedos, sighs and nods in solemn agreement. From my unassigned, hidden seat at the very back of the room, wearing a minimalist dark suit that blends directly into the shadows, I feel my stomach tighten. The hypocrisy radiating from the stage is so thick it could choke the entire room. Behind my parents, a massive high-definition LED screen illuminates the ballroom with a carefully curated slideshow. The subject of the presentation is my younger brother, Grant Johnson. The screen flashes bright, vibrant images of Grant looking like the absolute model of modern American success. There is Grant standing proudly in front of his elite private startup academy, Grant holding a prestigious diploma, Grant smiling smugly behind the wheel of a European luxury sedan, Grant shaking hands with city officials on a newly funded community campus. He has always been the golden boy, the untouchable prince of the Johnson household. The crowd erupts into applause at his fabricated achievements. I look at those glossy photographs and grip the edges of the thick leather folder resting on my lap. Beside it sits a small, silver USB drive. I know the exact truth about those pictures. I know the precise origin of every single dollar that paid for that expensive private academy, that car, that perfectly tailored suit. None of it belonged to them. Every single smile on that giant screen was purchased with stolen money. The applause eventually fades, and the hired master of ceremonies steps up to the wooden podium. He has a booming, confident voice designed specifically to loosen the wallets of the high-net-worth individuals sitting at the VIP tables down in front. He announces that the BrightPath Future Fund is seeking a massive new round of backing, aiming to secure over $2 million in fresh grants tonight alone. But to prove their absolute, unquestionable integrity to these top-tier investors and the scrutinizing local media, the fund has voluntarily submitted to a rigorous, independent, and completely transparent financial audit. He speaks the word transparency as if it is a holy vow. The screen behind the master of ceremonies transitions from Grant's beaming face to a sleek, sharp corporate logo. The audience murmurs in genuine, impressed surprise. The logo belongs to Holloway Forensic Advisory. It is not some standard neighborhood bookkeeping firm. Holloway is a heavyweight institution known for ruthlessly tearing apart corporate fraud, tracing offshore tax evasion, and dismantling white-collar crime syndicates down to the very last missing penny. Bringing them in is supposed to be the ultimate flex of innocence. My father, Richard, puffs his chest out proudly on stage. They wanted to show the wealthy donors that they have absolutely nothing to hide by hiring the most aggressive financial hounds in the entire sector. What Richard and Elaine Johnson do not know is that I am the lead forensic auditor at Holloway. They have not spoken to me in exactly 7 years. When they happily signed the engagement letter and the strict non-disclosure agreements with my firm weeks ago, they only looked at the signature of the senior technical lead assigned to handle their case. They saw a simple initial and a last name, L. Johnson, certified fraud examiner. To them, Johnson is just a common surname lost in a sea of corporate paperwork. They never once imagined that the estranged daughter they callously discarded would be the exact same person holding the magnifying glass over their meticulously forged ledgers. I wrapped my fingers around the porcelain cup, and the cold ceramic pulled me straight back to Briar Glen. 7 years ago, I sat at that same table and asked for help with tuition. Instead, I watched my father fund Grant and heard my mother tell me to figure it out. Something in me went quiet that night and started calculating. The Master of Ceremonies is now asking the representative from Holloway Forensic Advisory to please come forward to the stage and officially certify the fund's flawless financial health. The bright spotlight sweeps blindly across the dark room, searching the tables for the auditor. I stand up slowly. I pick up my heavy leather folder and my silver USB drive. I smooth out the front of my dark jacket. I step out of the shadows and directly into the center aisle. My parents still cannot see me clearly through the glaring, blinding stage lights. I take my first step forward. Tonight is not about screaming. Tonight is not about throwing a bitter tantrum or seeking messy emotional revenge against the people who broke my heart. Tonight is about stepping up to a microphone and reading a crime out loud. Number by brutal number. 7 years ago. The air in our kitchen in Briar Glen smelled like burnt garlic and cheap lemon dish soap. I was 19 years old. I had just walked through the front door holding a thick envelope from the State University. It was an official acceptance letter to their prestigious accounting and data analytics program. I felt a rare, fragile spark of pride, a naive hope that my parents might finally look at me and see a daughter worth investing in. I waited patiently until we were all seated around the scratched oak dining table. I slid the crisp white paper across the wood toward my mother. I explained that the tuition for a public school was reasonable, but I desperately needed a small push to get started. I asked if they could co-sign a modest student loan, or perhaps help with just the first $2,000 for the initial semester. My mother, Elaine, did not even bother to read the letter. She pushed it back toward me with the tip of her silver fork. She looked at me with eyes that held zero warmth and delivered the line that would echo in my head for the next 84 months. She told me I was the smart one. She told me to figure it out. The sheer finality of her voice was a physical blow, but what happened next was the true, agonizing betrayal. Not even 5 minutes later, before the dinner plates were even cleared, my father pulled a leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket. He clicked his expensive pen and began writing a massive check right there on the table. It was not for the mortgage or a medical emergency. It was for Grant. My younger brother had recently decided he wanted to attend a private entrepreneurial startup academy, a glorified networking club disguised as a school that cost roughly $35,000 a year. As my father signed his name, he cheerfully assured Grant that they had already secured a lease for a luxury downtown apartment. He promised they would handle his monthly living stipend, his utility bills, and a generous down payment on a reliable, late-model car. Grant sat there, swirling his iced tea, completely unbothered by the brutal contrast unfolding in front of me. He looked over at me, flashing a half-joking, half-contemptuous smirk. He shrugged his shoulders and casually stated that I always survived on my own anyway. He said I was the tough sister who never needed anyone to hold her hand. That was the dark magic trick of the Johnson family. They constantly weaponized my independence. They labeled me the strong one so they could feel absolutely zero guilt about abandoning me to the wolves. I sat frozen in my wooden chair, the sounds of their celebratory chatter fading into a dull, ringing buzz in my ears. My mind drifted back through the past 4 years of my life. I thought about the hundreds of hours I spent ringing up groceries at the local supermarket and folding heavy denim jeans at the mall since I turned 16. I remembered pulling cash from my worn wallet and handing over envelopes of wrinkled bills to my father because he claimed we had a sudden family emergency, like a broken water heater or dangerously bald car tires. I remembered coming home from a grueling double shift to find my mother crying in the living room about unpaid electricity bills or essential medical prescriptions. She would practically beg to borrow from my meager savings jar. Promising to pay me back next payday, I always gave it to them. I gave them every single dollar because I genuinely believed we were a family struggling to survive together. More painfully, I remembered the hushed, private conversations with my late grandmother, shortly before she passed away. She pulled me aside in her hospital room and held my hands. Her voice was frail, but her words were crystal clear. She promised me she had set aside a dedicated education fund, a modest but highly meaningful savings account split equally between Grant and me. She wanted to make sure we both had a fair, debt-free start in the adult world, but every single time I gently brought up my grandmother's fund after her funeral, my parents abruptly changed the subject. They gave vague, aggressive excuses about complex probate courts, unexpected legal fees, and indefinitely locked assets. I stopped asking because children are biologically programmed to trust the people who gave them life. That night at the dinner table, I did not scream. I did not throw my water glass at the wall or flip the porcelain plates. I did not shed a single loud, messy tear. Instead, something fundamental shifted deep inside my chest. It was a freezing sensation, a sudden cold snap that traveled up my spine and settled firmly in my brain. It was as if a heavy, rusted iron switch had been flipped violently, turning off the desperate daughter who begged for their affection and turning on a silent, highly analytical observer. I excused myself quietly from the table and walked up the narrow, carpeted stairs to my bedroom. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my sagging mattress. I opened my cheap, secondhand laptop. I needed to log into the State University portal to see if I could arrange a manageable monthly payment plan or defer my enrollment entirely so I could work another year. I opened my personal email inbox to search for the financial aid department link. Sitting right there at the very top of my unread messages was an automated alert. It was a past due notice from a prominent private student loan servicer, a massive financial institution I had never once interacted with. I stared at the glowing screen, my brow furrowing in deep, unsettling confusion. I had never applied for a private loan. I did not even own a basic credit card yet. My hands began to shake slightly as I clicked the link and navigated the complex security prompts. I decided, for the very first time in my 19 years of life, to pull a comprehensive copy of my personal credit report, the digital document loaded line by terrifying line. As my eyes scanned the columns of numbers, origination dates, and account statuses, the coldness in my brain turned into sharp, blinding clarity. There were multiple active accounts. There were high balances in the tens of thousands of dollars. There were severe missed payments negatively impacting the score. All of them were legally attached to my personal Social Security number, but absolutely none of them belonged to me. I looked back toward my closed bedroom door, visualizing the three of them laughing downstairs over dessert. I realized with sickening absolute certainty that the dinner I had just endured was not simply a tragic display of toxic parental favoritism. The kitchen table was the active scene of a massive, highly calculated financial fraud. The glowing blue light of my laptop screen illuminated the dark walls of my bedroom. I scrolled down the digital document, my eyes scanning the harsh black text. Over the span of exactly 18 months, an entire shadow life had been constructed under my identity. There were multiple consumer credit cards maxed out to their limits and 3 massive educational loans. I tallied the spelled-out principal balances in my head. The total sum was a staggering figure, easily enough money to completely change the trajectory of my entire life. It was enough to pay for a 4-year degree at the public university, secure a safe apartment, and leave me with a comfortable emergency fund. Instead, it was an anchor tied directly around my neck. My eyes locked onto the origination date of the largest student loan on the list. The date of the initial disbursement was exactly 2 weeks before Grant proudly announced his enrollment at his elite private startup academy. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind. The reality of the situation was so much darker than simple neglect. My parents had not merely abandoned me to fend for myself. They had actively harvested my clean financial identity to bankroll their favored child. They had sacrificed my future on the altar of his comfort. A hot, searing wave of adrenaline flooded my veins. The instinct to storm down the stairs, kick open their bedroom door, and scream until my lungs bled was nearly overpowering. But the cold, analytical part of my brain, the part that had kept me surviving all these years, clamped down hard on that impulse. Anger is careless. Anger leaves messes. I needed to be surgical. I slipped out of my room and crept silently down the hallway. The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I slipped into my father's home office and closed the heavy oak door behind me. I did not dare turn on the overhead light. I used the tiny, focused beam of a small pen light. I knew exactly where he kept his important documents. I bypassed the standard filing cabinet and went straight to the locked bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. The key was always hidden in the hollowed-out base of his brass desk lamp. I unlocked the drawer and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Inside, I found a secondary folder labeled simply with the word family. I opened it and my breath caught in my throat. Neatly organized inside were pristine photocopies of my Social Security card and my original birth certificate. Behind those were several sheets of lined paper completely covered in practiced, repeated attempts at forging my signature. But the most damning documents were the printed confirmations of the digital loan applications. I did not panic. I sat down in his heavy leather desk chair. I pulled a small notepad from my pocket and began writing a strict, prioritized list of tasks. Step 1 was to initiate a hard freeze on all my credit profiles. Step 2 was to secure every single piece of physical and digital evidence. Step 3 was to contact the respective fraud departments. Step 4 was to build an absolute, unbreakable timeline of events. I took out my phone and began photographing every single page in the folder. I captured the forged signatures, the application dates, and the routing numbers. I immediately uploaded the high-resolution images to a newly created, encrypted email address that no one else knew existed. I then transferred a backup copy to a small, portable hard drive I kept on my keychain. If I confronted them right now without securing the data, I knew my father would run straight to a paper shredder. I had to guarantee the evidence was indestructible before they even knew I was hunting them. I quietly returned to my bedroom and locked the door. I pulled out my laptop and dialed the 24-hour customer service hotline for the largest private lender on the list. I navigated the automated menus and finally reached a sleepy night shift representative. Under the guise of a concerned borrower experiencing a strange technical glitch, I politely asked the agent to verify the specific Internet Protocol address used to electronically sign the master promissory note. The representative read off a long string of numbers. I cross-referenced it with the wireless router settings of my parents' house. It was a perfect, indisputable match. The digital footprint was permanently cemented inside the four walls of this very home. I had just planted a massive, unshakable legal thread that would eventually unravel their entire scheme. As I continued digging through the photographed documents, I discovered a detail that hurt far worse than the stolen money. I looked closely at a copy of their most recent federal tax return. Right there on the second page, my parents had legally declared me as a fully dependent child, living comfortably at home and receiving their financial support. They had deliberately falsified their federal tax information to legitimize the fraudulent student loans and to claim a lucrative tax exemption. They were literally profiting off the lie of providing for me, while actively bleeding my future dry. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. The sky outside my window was still pitch black. I pulled a single, sturdy suitcase from the back of my closet. I did not pack any sentimental items. I packed only my laptop, my original identification documents, the physical hard drive, and enough sensible clothing to last a few weeks. I zipped the bag shut. The metallic sound echoed with a strange, satisfying finality in the quiet room. I walked downstairs for the last time. I did not draft a dramatic farewell letter. I did not leave a single note explaining my departure or my discoveries. Leaving a note is an act of negotiation. It is a plea to be understood. I had absolutely nothing left to negotiate with these people. I walked into the dark kitchen and stood by the marble island. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my brass house key. I placed it gently on the cold stone counter. The metal made a soft, sharp clink. I looked at the empty room and took a slow, deep breath. The scared, desperate daughter who just wanted a little bit of help was officially dead. I turned around and walked out the front door into the freezing morning air. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to myself right then and there. From now on, I do not ask for fairness. I audit it. The transition from that freezing morning into the rest of my life was not a cinematic montage accompanied by an inspiring, triumphant soundtrack. It was a brutal, exhausting arithmetic of sheer survival. I moved into a cramped, drafty room in a decaying house shared with 4 other struggling students near the State University campus. To pay for my public tuition and the mounting legal fees required to untangle my stolen identity, I built a daily schedule that left absolutely zero room for human error, sickness, or fatigue. During the week, my alarm went off long before the sun came up. I attended my morning lectures, absorbing complex financial theories and advanced data models while my stomach growled on a strict diet of bulk rice and discount canned beans. By mid-afternoon, I was hunched over a flickering computer screen in the windowless back room of a local strip mall tax office, doing mind-numbing data entry for minimum wage. When the tax office closed its doors at dusk, I walked 6 blocks in the dark to a greasy neighborhood diner, tying a stained apron around my waist for the evening rush. I poured black coffee, carried heavy trays, and wiped down sticky tables until midnight. On the weekends, when my peers were sleeping off parties or going on relaxing trips funded by their families, I was wearing heavy steel-toed boots in a massive distribution warehouse on the edge of town. I hauled heavy cardboard boxes onto wooden pallets for 12 solid hours a day, breathing in exhaust fumes and dust. It was a harsh, unforgiving existence rooted entirely in logic and necessity, completely devoid of any magical strokes of luck. There were countless nights when I sat alone on the bare floor of my tiny bedroom, staring at my cracked fingernails and bruised hands, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the exhaustion. I would watch my classmates carelessly swipe premium credit cards their fathers paid for, or listen to them complain bitterly in the campus courtyard about how their mothers bought them the wrong color of luxury winter coats. In those moments, a dark, suffocating resentment would threaten to drown me. I desperately wanted to quit. I wanted to scream at the fundamental, ugly unfairness of the universe, but every single time the physical and mental fatigue pushed me right to the brink of collapse. I would close my eyes and picture the smooth glide of my father's expensive pen signing that massive tuition check for Grant. I would hear the condescending, arrogant smirk in my brother's voice echoing in my ears. The raw humiliation of that night transformed from a bleeding emotional wound into a cold, hard, and infinite fuel source. Pure discipline replaced my grief. Academically, I gravitated instantly toward forensic accounting and fraud analytics. While standard accounting focuses heavily on balancing the books and ensuring compliance, forensic work is the meticulous art of finding the financial bodies buried beneath those books. I realized very quickly that human beings can lie flawlessly with their words, their sympathetic tears, and their lavish charity galas. But numbers, when interrogated correctly and aggressively, physically cannot sustain a lie over a long period of time. I wanted to learn exactly how to break a liar down to their inescapable mathematical core. My obsessive, relentless focus eventually caught the attention of my senior auditing professor. He noticed I was not just completing the assigned corporate case studies, I was actively dissecting them, finding secondary layers of hypothetical embezzlement that were not even part of his original curriculum. During my junior year, He pulled me aside after a demanding lecture and handed me a thick, embossed business card. He told me I had a terrifying, predatory instinct for financial discrepancies. He officially recommended me for a highly competitive, coveted internship at Holloway Forensic Advisory. Holloway was an absolute revelation. It was a firm dedicated entirely to corporate autopsies, specializing in dismantling fraudulent investment funds, tracing insider financial manipulation, and exposing intentionally misleading corporate reporting. I absorbed their methodologies like a starving animal. I learned the sacred, unbreakable importance of the chain of custody for digital evidence. I learned the meticulous, painstaking technique of matching a single, obscure ledger entry to a corresponding vendor invoice, tracking that specific invoice to a routed wire transfer, and following that transfer through layers of dummy corporations until it hit the ultimate beneficiary. More importantly, I learned how to draft investigative reports with such airtight, devastating, and indisputable logic that aggressive corporate defense lawyers would read them and immediately advise their wealthy clients to surrender. During this grueling period of reinvention, I also had to make a fundamental decision about my identity. Many victims of severe familial abuse or catastrophic identity theft choose to legally change their names, desperately seeking a fresh start and a clean slate away from their abusers. I flatly refused to give them that power over me. I filled out every legal document, every employment tax form, and every single academic paper with the name Lucy Johnson. I made a firm, internal declaration that I was not the one who needed to hide in the shadows. I was not the one who should feel a single ounce of shame. Let my parents keep the guilt and the dirty secrets. I was keeping my name as a permanent reminder of exactly who I survived. A significant turning point in my early career came during my second year as a junior associate at the firm. We were investigating a mid-sized community charity suspected of commingling public donations with private assets. While the senior partners were bogged down in arguing over complex tax codes and operational bylaws, I spent 3 grueling days analyzing their vendor payment schedules in total isolation. I noticed a subtle, repeating rhythm in the monthly disbursements to an alleged event planning company. I flagged the hidden pattern, mapped the shell company directly to the charity's sitting vice president, and broke the entire case wide open. My department director called me into his spacious office the very next morning. He looked at my neatly bound report and told me I had an unnatural, almost eerie ability to read a fraud model before the ink was even dry on the fake invoices. Parallel to my rising professional career, I was quietly and methodically dismantling the fraudulent debt my parents had strapped to my back all those years ago. I worked closely with specialized consumer protection attorneys, submitting the police reports, the network routing logs, and the forged signature samples I had smuggled out of my father's desk. It took years of tedious, exhausting bureaucratic warfare, but I slowly and legally scrubbed every single illicit loan off my personal credit file. Through that grueling, paper-heavy legal process, I learned my most valuable life lesson. I learned how to completely detach my personal recovery from my emotional anger. Vengeance is messy, erratic, and inherently self-destructive. Justice, true justice, is just a meticulously well-documented process. 7 years passed in a blur of spreadsheets, legal briefings, and thousands of cups of cheap black coffee. The terrified, desperate 19-year-old girl who fled into the freezing morning air no longer existed. At 26 years old, I was officially promoted to lead forensic auditor at Holloway. I was the youngest person in the entire history of the firm to hold the prestigious title. I had my own corner office, a dedicated team of brilliant junior analysts, and a solid industry reputation for being absolutely ruthless and unyielding with a corporate ledger. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the administrative assistant walked in and dropped a thick, fresh acquisition file onto my heavy glass desk. The firm had just been retained by a major commercial bank to conduct a comprehensive transparency audit on a high-profile educational charity seeking millions in new, leveraged funding. I picked up the heavy manila folder. I flipped open the cover to review the corporate registration documents and the legal names of the primary executive directors. My eyes locked onto the typed letters, and the temperature in my bright office seemed to plummet instantly to freezing. The names staring back at me in stark black ink were Richard Johnson, Elaine Johnson, and Grant Johnson. The heavy manila folder rested on my glass desk like an unexploded bomb. The client was BrightPath Future Fund. The retaining entity was North Ledger Bank, a massive commercial financial institution preparing to underwrite a multi-million-dollar credit guarantee and facilitate an unprecedented round of institutional grants. The bank required an ironclad, independent transparency audit before they disbursed a single penny. They had hired Holloway Forensic Advisory to provide that absolute assurance. I stared at the glossy corporate registration documents inside the folder. The managing directors were listed in bold black ink as Richard and Elaine Johnson, right beneath their names. Holding the official title of Director of Program Operations was Grant Johnson. The universe has a profoundly sick sense of humor. My immediate reaction was dictated entirely by the strict ethical code of my profession. Within 10 minutes of opening the file, I was sitting in the spacious corner office of the senior managing partner. I placed the dossier on his desk and formally declared a severe, insurmountable conflict of interest. I explained the exact nature of my biological relationship with the executive board of the fund. I formally requested to be recused from the entire investigation. Citing the massive professional liability of having an estranged family member auditing her own parents, the managing partner listened quietly. Steepling his fingers, when I finished my explanation, he did not reach for the file to assign it to another team. Instead, he leaned forward and told me that my deep, specialized understanding of charity fraud models was exactly why North Ledger Bank demanded our firm in the first place. This was not a standard bookkeeping exercise. The bank already suspected highly sophisticated financial layering within the fund. My superior argued that stepping away entirely would compromise the technical integrity of the audit. We reached a rigid, unorthodox compromise. I would remain on the project exclusively as the lead technical forensic analyst to ensure absolute compliance and protect the firm from any future accusations of personal bias or retaliation. Holloway implemented a massive structural firewall. They assigned a senior oversight partner to review every single one of my technical conclusions. Furthermore, an internal legal counsel was embedded directly into my team. I was strictly forbidden from initiating any direct contact with the client. I was to be a ghost in the machine, existing only to dissect the ledgers, the invoices, and the wire transfers. Emotion was entirely stripped from the equation, replaced by an unbreakable chain of legal oversight. With the professional boundaries firmly established, I began digging into the public-facing profile of the BrightPath Future Fund. What I found in their marketing materials was a psychological paradox so bitterly ironic it made my chest ache physically. My parents had spent the last several years meticulously building a public image as dedicated, selfless philanthropists. Their core mission statement was plastered across every digital brochure and press release, proclaiming their absolute dedication to helping underprivileged, overlooked students secure the financial resources necessary to attend college. I sat in my quiet office, watching a local news segment from a few months prior. My mother, wearing a modest pastel blouse, looked directly into the camera and spoke passionately about the devastating barrier of university tuition. She shed a perfectly calculated tear, talking about the tragic loss of human potential when young. Bright minds are denied an education simply because they lack family support. They were actively selling a manufactured morality based exactly on the profound betrayal they had inflicted upon their own daughter. They had built an entire lucrative brand out of the very empathy they had ruthlessly denied me at the dinner table. The media files only grew more sickening. I clicked on the flagship promotional video for their upcoming fundraising campaign. High-definition drone footage swept over a gleaming community center before cutting to a beautifully lit interview with the Director of Program Operations. Grant filled the screen, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He smiled with practiced humility. He spoke into the microphone about how he was once given a profound educational opportunity, a chance that changed his life trajectory forever. He claimed he returned to his hometown to serve the community, to ensure no child ever felt abandoned by the financial system. He was taking the blood money stolen from my identity and twisting it into a heroic, charitable origin story. As I read through a corresponding feature article in a prominent regional lifestyle magazine, I discovered exactly how they had explained my absence to their wealthy donors. The journalist had gently asked Elaine about her own children. My mother sighed heavily, clutching a silver pendant necklace, and told the reporter that while her son was her greatest operational partner, her eldest daughter was a source of private family heartbreak. She publicly described me as a deeply unstable, troubled young woman who had aggressively severed ties and moved far away. Choosing a life of chaotic isolation, they had weaponized my disappearance, using my forced exile as a tragic prop to garner even more sympathy and trust from their high-net-worth investors. They painted themselves as resilient, grieving parents turning their private pain into public good. Later that afternoon, a courier delivered a stack of heavy gold-embossed envelopes to the Holloway reception desk. They were the official invitations to the upcoming BrightPath Future Fund Transparency Gala. This was not merely a celebratory dinner, it was a high-stakes financial summit. The gala was the exact moment BrightPath planned to leverage our preliminary audit certification to officially close the massive funding round, finalize the North Ledger Bank credit guarantee, and permanently cement their political influence in the region. I held the thick cardstock in my hands, feeling the raised gold lettering beneath my thumb. My parents had absolutely no idea that L. Johnson, the lead forensic analyst legally bound to review their deepest financial secrets, was the unstable daughter they had casually slandered in the press. They believed they had successfully buried my existence beneath their lies. A younger version of myself might have panicked. A younger version might have marched back into the managing partner's office and begged to be removed, terrified of the impending collision between my past trauma and my present reality. But the woman standing in the corner office was not that terrified 19-year-old girl anymore. I placed the gold-embossed invitation gently on my glass desk, right next to the towering stack of their subpoenaed bank statements. I decided right then that I would stay on the case. I would not chase a personal confrontation. I would follow the audit process to the letter and let the evidence do the damage. The war room at Holloway Forensic Advisory was a windowless, climate-controlled bunker humming with the sound of high-powered servers and cooling fans. My specialized team of 4 junior analysts and the embedded legal counsel sat around a massive conference table entirely buried under mountains of printed bank statements, vendor invoices, and event receipts. For the first 2 weeks, the BrightPath Future Fund looked absolutely bulletproof. The ledger balanced down to the very last cent. Every single dollar of incoming donation was meticulously matched to an outgoing charitable disbursement. But as any seasoned fraud examiner knows, perfection is the very first symptom of a lie. Real financial ecosystems are messy. They have delayed payments, canceled checks, and human errors. BrightPath was entirely too clean. I directed my team to stop looking at the math and start interrogating the reality behind the math. We began running the comprehensive master list of scholarship recipients through advanced skip tracing software and municipal public records. The first major crack in their facade appeared on a rainy Thursday afternoon. An analyst flagged a designated grant of $15,000 awarded to a local high school senior. The paperwork was flawless, complete with an essay and a signed acceptance letter. The only problem was that, according to state utility and census records, the recipient's family had moved to a completely different state exactly 4 years before the scholarship was supposedly awarded. We dug deeper and unearthed a graveyard of ghost students. Over 20% of the fund's listed beneficiaries were entirely fabricated or misappropriated from old, defunct community rosters. The money was being officially dispersed, but it was vanishing into the ether. We pivoted our focus to follow those vanishing funds, turning our attention to the operational expenses. Nonprofits require vendors for their fundraising galas, marketing materials, and educational seminars. BrightPath had a roster of 5 primary service providers taking massive cuts of the donor capital. There was an event management group, a boutique printing press, and a specialized educational consulting firm. I spent an entire weekend manually tracing their corporate registration histories and cross-referencing their billing details. The facade crumbled completely. All 5 distinct companies utilized the exact same anonymous post office box located in a neighboring county. Furthermore, they all routed their incoming payments through the same obscured registered agent. They were not legitimate businesses. They were interconnected shell companies. Empty vessels specifically designed to siphon charitable donations back into private hands. As we meticulously mapped the flow of the stolen money, the investigation took a violently personal turn. I was reviewing the digitized archive of the fund's original incorporation documents and the minutes from their very first board meetings. I scrolled down to the compliance section of a critical financial review form from several years ago. My breath suddenly caught in my throat, freezing my lungs. Right there, stamped at the bottom of the page approving the initial budget, was my own name. It read, Lucy Johnson, Volunteer Finance Reviewer. My hands trembled slightly as I zoomed in on the signature. I had never once attended a board meeting, let alone volunteered to authorize their fraudulent budgets. I immediately pulled the digital file into our forensic extraction software to strip the metadata. The hidden digital footprint was undeniable. The document properties revealed it had been created and modified on a personal computer registered to Grant. I stared at the curves of the ink on the screen. It was not just a close imitation. It was a flawless, pixel-perfect copy. I recognized the exact loop of the letter Y and the slant of the capital J. It was my signature from a high school field trip permission slip, scanned, digitally isolated, and pasted onto federal charity documents. The sheer audacity of the forgery fueled a new wave of relentless auditing. With the shell companies identified, my team subpoenaed the secondary bank accounts tied to that anonymous post office box. The veil was completely ripped away. The funds that BrightPath claimed were being used to print educational brochures and host underprivileged youth seminars were being funneled directly into my parents' personal accounts. We tracked $40,000 of supposed scholarship money flowing seamlessly into a luxury kitchen renovation for their primary residence. We found wire transfers covering first-class airfare for extravagant European vacations. We even uncovered a recurring monthly retainer paid to an elite public relations firm, specifically hired to curate their fake philanthropic image in the local media. They were literally using money meant for starving students to buy themselves a glossy, saintly reputation. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. As the embedded legal counsel reviewed our findings, the gravity of the situation shifted entirely. The fund was not just lying to wealthy local donors at their cocktail parties. They had actively utilized these fabricated financial reports and forged board approvals to secure massive tax exemptions from the Federal Revenue Service. Moreover, they had submitted this exact same falsified ledger to North Ledger Bank to secure their multi-million-dollar credit guarantee. This was no longer a simple case of ethical bankruptcy or civil mismanagement. My parents had crossed the hard, unforgiving line into federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and bank fraud. The legal counsel confirmed that the sheer dollar amount involved elevated the crimes to severe felonies carrying mandatory federal prison sentences. Late that night, while finalizing the cross-references for the final report, I stumbled upon one last, sickening detail buried deep in a legacy archival system. I found a string of dormant administrative accounts used to artificially inflate the fund's credibility metrics during its critical second year of operation. One of the primary guarantor profiles was registered using a slightly truncated version of my personal Social Security number, long after I had packed my single suitcase and fled into the dark. Long after they had publicly written me off as a chaotic failure, they were still quietly bleeding my identity dry to prop up their empire of lies. They had kept my ghost chained to their ledger to make themselves look legitimate to the federal government. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting in the dark glass of my office window. The scattered pieces of the puzzle had finally formed a complete, horrifying picture. This was never just a tragic family drama about parents loving one child more than the other. It was not a simple story of favoritism or neglect. I was looking at a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient criminal syndicate that had simply decided to wear the comforting, untouchable disguise of a family charity, and they were about to walk onto a brightly lit stage and ask for millions more. When Holloway Forensic Advisory issued the second round of supplemental document requests, the pristine facade of the BrightPath Future Fund finally began to crack. We explicitly demanded the original, unredacted invoices for the 5 interconnected shell companies and the complete banking routing numbers associated with the phantom vendors. My father, Richard, reacted exactly as a cornered narcissist would. He aggressively attempted to circumvent the established auditing procedure. He bombarded our firm with hostile emails, complaining bitterly about the tedious bureaucracy and demanding an immediate, private meeting with the lead technical investigator. He wanted to sit in a room and use his practiced executive presence to intimidate whoever was scrutinizing his books. He had absolutely no idea he was demanding an audience with the daughter he had thrown away. 2 days after Richard began his aggressive pushback, my personal cell phone vibrated on my office desk. I did not recognize the local number, but the moment I answered, the voice sent a freezing shock straight down my spine. It was Elaine, after 7 years of absolute, unbroken silence. My mother was calling me. Her tone was dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness that I had not heard since I was a child. She called me her darling girl. She suggested we meet for a private, intimate family dinner to heal old wounds and reconnect. She did not explicitly mention the ongoing audit, but the timing was a glaring neon sign. They had seen the name L. Johnson on the official correspondence. They were not entirely sure it was me leading the investigation, but the sheer panic of the possibility had forced them to reach out. They smelled the smoke and were desperately trying to locate the source of the fire. Later that same evening, the manipulation escalated. My phone lit up with a massive block of text from Grant. He completely abandoned the fake warmth our mother tried to sell and went straight for the psychological leverage. He claimed our parents were under immense, crushing financial pressure back when I left. He painted them as flawed but ultimately well-meaning victims of circumstance. Then came the bribe, wrapped tightly in a suffocating layer of moral guilt. He explicitly suggested that if I was indeed the auditor reviewing their files, we could quietly arrange a generous, off-the-books compensation package to make up for the past. He begged me not to tear down the fund, claiming my actions would destroy the futures of countless underprivileged students. It was a textbook, predatory attempt to make me the villain of their own crime. I did not reply to Grant. I did not return my mother's phone call to scream about the past. Engaging in a volatile emotional argument is the absolute fastest way to lose professional credibility. Instead, I took meticulous screenshots of the text messages. I downloaded the audio file of my mother's voicemail. I immediately forwarded every single piece of correspondence to the embedded internal legal counsel at Holloway. By attempting to bribe and emotionally manipulate the lead examiner, my family had just handed me irrefutable, documented proof of their intent to obstruct an independent financial review. They eventually realized their charm offensive had failed, so they resorted to digital vandalism. At 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, my automated security alerts began blaring. Someone using Grant's administrative credentials was actively logging into the fund's shared cloud portal. I watched in real time as entire directories containing the fraudulent vendor contracts and the misappropriated scholarship lists were systematically deleted. They thought they were burning the evidence before the bank could see it. They were completely unaware that on my very first day leading the technical review, I had established a secure, immutable snapshot of the entire server architecture. I also activated hidden access logs. I sat in the dark glow of my home office, quietly drinking a glass of water, while I recorded every single keystroke of their panicked destruction. They were not erasing their crimes. They were merely adding the felony of tampering with corporate documents to their rapidly growing list of offenses. The following morning, I presented the server logs to my managing partner. He looked at the undeniable proof of data destruction, but a shadow of concern crossed his face. He asked me directly if the psychological pressure of investigating my own family was compromising my objectivity. He worried that aggressive defense attorneys would frame this as a targeted, vindictive witch hunt fueled by personal bias. I did not get defensive. I simply slid the heavy, meticulously organized binder of technical evidence across his desk. I showed him the unassailable chain of custody, the server snapshots, and the documented bribery attempts. My absolute, chilling calmness extinguished his doubts instantly. He realized I was not acting out of anger. I was operating with the cold, lethal precision of a forensic mechanism. Returning to my desk, I began sorting through the recovered files from the late-night deletion event. Buried deep within a folder mislabeled as miscellaneous legal correspondence, I found a scanned document that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a handwritten letter. I recognized the elegant, sweeping cursive immediately. It was from my late grandmother. It was a formal instruction letter addressed to her estate lawyer, clearly outlining a dedicated educational trust meant to be divided equally between Grant and me. Attached to the letter was a dated bank transfer receipt. Richard and Elaine had intercepted the funds during the estate probate, completely bypassed the intended trust, and directly injected my grandmother's money into the Bright Path Future Fund as its initial seed capital. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The money I had begged for at that dinner table 7 years ago was never theirs to withhold. It had always been mine. My parents had stolen my rightful inheritance to build the very foundation of their fake charitable empire, and then they had the absolute audacity to publicly brand themselves as the selfless saviors of education. The theft had come full circle. My tuition money was robbed not just once, but repackaged and weaponized into a brand of helping children. The narrative of a misunderstood family was dead and buried forever. I closed the digital file and picked up my pen. I was no longer just preparing a standard internal advisory report for the Holloway partners. I opened a new, highly restricted document. I began drafting a comprehensive, unredacted evidentiary appendix explicitly addressed to the senior legal counsel at North Ledger Bank and the Federal Grant Oversight Committee. I was preparing the final nails for their coffin. The clock ticking down to the Bright Path Future Fund annual gala was no longer just a countdown to a social event. It was the fuse on a massive financial time bomb. North Ledger Bank had officially scheduled the gala as the precise moment they would publicly announce their funding partnership and sign the irrevocable credit commitment. The stakes were absolute. If I did not act before the ink dried on those contracts, millions of dollars in leveraged capital would immediately unlock and flood into my parents' accounts. Once that money dispersed into their complex web of offshore shell companies, recovering it would be mathematically and legally impossible. I sat in my office and finalized the draft conclusion of the forensic audit. The document was a bloodbath of financial terminology. I categorically detailed the material misstatements, the systemic beneficiary fraud, the concealed conflicts of interest, the forged signatures, the severe tax evasion risks, and the textbook credit fraud. It was a flawless, airtight execution on paper, but executing it in the real world required navigating a minefield of corporate liability. The senior partners at Holloway Forensic Advisory called an emergency strategy session in the main boardroom. They were terrified of a catastrophic defamation countersuit. If we simply marched into a ballroom and accused prominent local philanthropists of federal crimes without the absolute backing of the bank, Richard and Elaine could sue our firm into oblivion. I stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table and proposed a watertight, lethal strategy. I told them we would not launch a public ambush. Instead, we would pre-notify the executive council at North Ledger Bank 48 hours before the event. We would instruct the bank to quietly freeze the disbursement mechanisms in the dark. We would let my parents stand on that stage and actively solicit new investments using the falsified prospectus, effectively trapping them in the act of committing federal wire fraud in front of hundreds of witnesses. Only then, at the absolute height of their leverage, would we drop the hammer. My parents, however, were not waiting passively for the blow to fall. The very next morning, my legal counsel forwarded me a press release that Elaine had quietly seeded to several prominent local society blogs. It was a preemptive strike, disguised as a heartfelt plea for mental health awareness. In the article, my mother wept about the tragic difficulties of navigating family trauma, heavily implying that her estranged eldest daughter was a deeply unstable individual who had previously embezzled money from the family estate and harbored dangerous, vindictive delusions. They were meticulously building a psychological firewall. They knew my name was on the auditing paperwork, and they were laying the groundwork to destroy my credibility. If I stood up and screamed about stolen money, the wealthy donors would just shake their heads. Pity at the crazy, jealous daughter trying to ruin her noble parents. I sat down with the firm's internal legal advisor, and we immediately adjusted our approach. I knew I could not let this turn into a dramatic family screaming match. If it became a he said/she said emotional spectacle, I would lose. I instructed the legal team that during the gala, my sole function would be to present the raw, unassailable data. I would not make a single accusation regarding my own stolen tuition or my forged signature. I would let the senior oversight partner and the bank's counsel read the legal conclusions and validate the chain of evidence. I stripped my ego completely out of the equation. Just as we locked in the presentation strategy, my secure office phone rang. The voice on the other end was young, trembling, and bordering on a panic attack. It was Mara, a 22-year-old junior accountant recently hired by the Bright Path Future Fund. She had secretly found my direct contact information buried in the audit correspondence. She told me she was terrified. Grant had cornered her in the office late that afternoon, physically blocking her exit until she used her security credentials to authorize a massive batch of unverified, ghost ledger entries. I did not ask Mara to meet me in a dark parking garage or act like a reckless detective. That is how whistleblowers get destroyed. I immediately patched my senior supervisor and our legal counsel onto the call. I placed Mara under the protective umbrella of official firm correspondence, instantly shielding her from being an isolated, vulnerable target. I instructed her to securely transfer the internal shadow ledger she had managed to download onto a flash drive. When we decrypted Mara's files later that evening, we uncovered the final, catastrophic twist of the entire investigation. Grant was not just doctoring the books to secure the bank loan. He had already scheduled an automated wire transfer to process through the bank the night of the gala. He was planning to drain the fund's remaining liquid assets, nearly $1 million, straight into an untraceable shell company. The transfer was set to execute precisely at 9 o'clock on the night of the gala. He had pre-written the accounting justification, labeling it as an emergency upfront commitment for an international scholarship program. They were not just trying to survive an audit, they were planning a massive, coordinated smash and grab while their wealthy donors were distracted drinking champagne. I looked at the scheduled timestamp on the screen. The sheer arrogance of the plan was breathtaking. They honestly believed they were untouchable. They thought they could rob the bank, rob the donors, and publicly humiliate me all in one single night. I closed the encrypted folder and locked my office door. The strategy was no longer just about presenting a report. It was about stopping a robbery in progress. I packed the finalized audit binders into my leather briefcase. I placed the silver storage drive containing Mara's whistleblower testimony into my pocket. I did not feel any fear, and I did not feel any blinding rage. I was simply a mechanism of consequence, polished and ready. I stepped out of the Holloway building and into the cool evening air. I was walking into the Grand Mercer Ballroom tonight, holding a beautifully disguised legal bear trap, meticulously calibrated to snap shut at the exact fraction of a second they believed they had won the world. I was back in the Grand Mercer Ballroom, seated alone at a dim table near the velvet drapes. My place card read L. Johnson, Holloway Forensic Advisory. A few guests glanced at the surname and moved on. Then Elaine saw me. For half a second, the color drained from her face before the smile snapped back into place. Then, across the sea of black tuxedos and shimmering silk gowns, my mother finally saw me. It was a fascinating physiological reaction to witness in real time. For exactly half a second, the blood completely drained from Elaine's face. Her polished, charitable mask slipped violently, revealing naked, freezing panic underneath. but she had been lying to the world for so long that her recovery was nearly instantaneous. A stiff, entirely fabricated smile stretched across her lips. She abruptly excused herself from a group of banking executives and made a direct, hurried line for my table in the shadows. She leaned down. The heavy, suffocating scent of her floral perfume nauseatingly familiar. She reached out, attempting to grasp my forearm, but I smoothly pulled my hands back and rested them on my leather binder. She kept her voice pitched in a low, frantic, conspiratorial whisper. She asked me to step out into the backstage hallway immediately, so we could just talk privately like adults and sort this whole misunderstanding out. I did not stand up. I did not break eye contact. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had coldly told me to figure it out 7 years ago, and I delivered a response stripped entirely of all human emotion. I told her that all communication regarding the ongoing financial audit required the strict presence of my senior supervisor and our internal legal counsel. I stated clearly that I was legally prohibited by my firm from engaging in any private, unrecorded dialogue with the subjects of the investigation. Her fake smile fractured completely. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, the terrifying realization washing over her that I was not a wounded daughter seeking emotional closure, but a steel vault she could not manipulate. She spun around without another word and hurried back into the thickest part of the crowd. Less than 10 minutes later, Grant slid smoothly into the empty chair beside me. He did not bother with the fake maternal warmth our mother had attempted. He leaned in close, his posture casually threatening, but his voice dripping with mock remorse. He offered a hollow, breathless apology for the past, claiming we all made selfish mistakes when we were young and that our parents were just trying to do their best. Then came the real, desperate reason for his visit. He casually shifted the topic, probing to see exactly how deep Holloway had dug into the ledger. He asked if we were ready to give the green light so the kids could finally get their scholarship money. I knew he was sweating profusely under his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. I gave him exactly what he needed to maintain his arrogant, fatal delusion. I looked down at my blank notepad and told him we were simply finalizing the standard reconciliation of the vendor disbursements and preparing the transparency certificate for the bank's final approval. It was a perfectly ambiguous, non-committal answer that technically held no lies. He exhaled a sharp, shuddering breath of relief, his signature arrogant smirk returning immediately to his face. He patted the table patronizingly, told me he was glad we could finally be professional about this business, and walked away to prepare for his grand theft. The tension in the room tightened as the dinner service ended and the waiters cleared the plates. The master of ceremonies stepped back to the podium and called for the room's full attention. He launched into a polished speech about integrity, community, and the millions pledged to the Bright Path Future Fund. Then he announced that the independent auditor would now present the official transparency certification. This was the exact moment they needed. They wanted my firm's verbal confirmation to trigger North Ledger Bank's final release. My secure phone vibrated silently against my thigh. I kept my eyes on the stage as I checked the encrypted message from Holloway's embedded legal counsel. North Ledger Bank's executive lawyers had successfully placed a temporary freeze on all disbursement channels, pending my verbal conclusion. The funds were locked. A financial crimes unit and federal grant oversight agents were already in position at the hotel. A second message flashed in from Mara, who was in a secure location with our lawyers. The server monitor had triggered another red alert. Someone was trying again to delete the primary vendor document folder. I looked toward the side curtain and saw Grant staring at a glowing tablet, jaw clenched, face pale. He was panicking. The 9 o'clock wire transfer was failing to clear, and he was making one last desperate attempt to destroy the records before anyone could trace the missing funds. I placed my phone face down, picked up the leather binder and the silver USB drive, and stood as the master of ceremonies called. L. Johnson, Holloway Forensic Advisory. The applause began polite, wealthy, expectant. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the dark back corner. I stood up. The walk from the dark back table to the brightly lit stage felt like stepping out of a long, suffocating tunnel. I did not rush. I climbed the short staircase, walked directly past the bewildered master of ceremonies, and adjusted the microphone stand. I did not smile. I did not offer a polite greeting to the wealthy crowd. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, sharp and freezing cold. "I am not here to certify transparency," I stated, the words slicing through the expectant silence. "I am here to present material findings." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of expensive tuxedos and silk gowns. Richard lunged forward, his face flushed a violent shade of crimson, attempting to physically block the microphone. Elaine grabbed the master of ceremonies' secondary mic, her voice shrill and trembling as she shrieked to the crowd that I was a vindictive, unstable girl trying to ruin a noble evening. Before security could even flinch, the senior oversight partner from Holloway Forensic Advisory and the lead executive counsel from North Ledger Bank stood up from their front row, VIP table. The bank's lawyer spoke in a loud, booming voice that commanded absolute authority. He explicitly confirmed to the entire room that my presentation was the official, legally mandated audit disclosure required under the strict terms of their financial contract. The room fell into a deathly, paralyzed silence. Richard and Elaine froze on stage, trapped by the very legal agreements they thought would save them. I opened my leather binder. I was brief, clinical, and devastatingly precise. I laid out the architecture of their fraud in plain, inescapable terms. I detailed the creation of the 5 shell vendors operating out of a single post office box. I exposed the misappropriation of charitable funds, tracing the donor money directly into their personal luxury home renovations and high-end travel accounts. I outlined the severe liability of submitting falsified financial health reports to federal tax agencies and banking institutions to secure millions of dollars in unwarranted credit. Then, I delivered the blow that was deeply personal but entirely legally relevant. I pressed a button on my presentation remote. The massive screen behind me switched from the glossy corporate logo to a stark, side-by-side, forensic document comparison. On the left side was a high school permission slip bearing my genuine signature. On the right was the foundational budget approval document for the charity. This fund was established using forged volunteer compliance authorizations, I announced to the silent room. Furthermore, the digital metadata, which is currently displayed beneath the documents, confirms that this forgery was executed directly from an administrative user account registered to Grant Johnson. Grant's arrogant facade shattered instantly. He grabbed a microphone from the podium, his voice cracking in sheer panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at our parents, desperately trying to throw them under the bus. He cried out that he was just a kid when it started, that they forced him to do it, and that he was entirely manipulated by their pressure. I did not argue with him. I simply pressed the button again. The screen shifted to display his internal corporate emails from earlier that very afternoon, ordering a junior staff member to falsify the current fiscal ledgers. Right beside those emails was a bank log timestamp. "You are not a manipulated child," I said, my voice steady and amplified. "You are the active architect of a scheduled wire transfer attempting to move nearly $1 million of remaining liquid charity assets into an untraceable offshore shell company at exactly 9 o'clock tonight." Richard tried one final, pathetic maneuver. He dropped his head, adopting the posture of a tragic martyr, and wailed that despite the sloppy accounting, every single thing they did was ultimately for the poor students. At that exact moment, the heavy side doors of the ballroom pushed open. Mara, the terrified junior accountant, walked in, flanked solidly by Holloway's corporate litigation attorney. She did not need to speak. Our lawyer handed a stack of sworn, notarized affidavits directly to the North Ledger Bank executives, legally confirming that Mara had been physically intimidated into signing fake financial figures just hours prior. The representative from North Ledger Bank stood up, his face pale with fury. He announced to the entire room, effective immediately, the absolute cancellation of the multi-million-dollar credit commitment and the hard freeze of all affiliated disbursement accounts. Total chaos erupted. Wealthy donors began shouting, pulling out their phones to call their own lawyers, and demanding their pledges back. Over the roar of the panicked crowd, the main double doors at the back of the hall swung wide open. A coordinated team of state financial investigators and federal grant oversight agents walked briskly down the center aisle. Their badges gleamed under the chandeliers. They stepped onto the stage, completely ignoring the outrage of the wealthy guests. They surrounded Richard, Elaine, and Grant, instructing them in low, hard voices to step off the stage and proceed to the holding rooms for immediate formal questioning. The crowd fell absolutely silent again, watching the untouchable philanthropists be escorted away like common thieves. I did not yell. I did not pump my fists or celebrate. I simply closed my heavy leather binder. I stepped up to the edge of the stage, looking directly at my parents as they were led toward the exit. 7 years ago, I asked for tuition help and was told to figure it out, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I did figure it out, and tonight, I also figured out the ledgers you tried so desperately to hide. Several months later, the Bright Path Future Fund was entirely dismantled. The state seized their assets, and the courts ordered a partial restitution of the stolen funds back to the defrauded donors and the hijacked legacy trusts. Working closely with Holloway and a team of ethical estate lawyers, I helped establish a new, aggressively transparent, and heavily monitored scholarship program. We named it after my grandmother, finally honoring the true intent of the money she had left behind. The cycle of theft was officially broken. Sometimes, justice does not arrive with a cinematic explosion or a dramatic screaming match. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, as a thick, meticulously documented report, read out loud at the exact right time, standing in front of the exact right people. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I love hearing from you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and share it with someone who'd enjoy it too.